So we get to finally talk about the Samsung Galaxy S9, and funny enough, the last couple of days, I've been spending a lot of time actually talking about this device because it is in a very interesting spot. It's not necessarily the first device I would recommend this year. If you still own this phone, then I think it's probably still worth it to some of you, but I really don't think this is a phone that people should be going out and currently buying, and the main reason for this is mostly because the Samsung Galaxy S10, which is the successor of this phone, is such a crazy good value in so many different ways. It's still supported with software, way better screen, way better build quality. It pretty much has everything going for it that it only makes sense for me to recommend that phone over this one. I still don't think this phone is a bad phone. I think it has a lot of capability, but do keep in mind that's pretty much my main synopsis of how I would sum this up. Now, first of all, on the body, now if you want to buy those phones, links are down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, the body of this phone and the way it looks is still top tier. It still looks very good, it still performs pretty decently, and the best thing about it, the display of this thing, 5.8-inch Super AMOLED display, and it is a very good looking panel. It's 1440p, and there's a little bit of bezel on the top and bottom, but it's not really that much, and it still looks pretty good. I've had very few complaints about it. You have, a little bit of a notch, not a notch, but you have like bezel up top, totally okay. You have the front-facing camera up there, no inbuilt fingerprint sensor in the display or anything, but you still have that USB Type-C port at the bottom. You still have that headphone jack, and you still have that micro SD card slot as well, which is crazy. Having this type of, I/O on this type of device is pretty insane to me. This was a phone that came out in 2018, and I still love having this type of, feature set. It's turning 4 years old probably next month, and it doesn't feel like a 4-year-old phone. There are some aspects of it, like the fingerprint sensor on the back and stuff, but having that micro SD card slot and that combo of USB Type-C port and headphone jack is one of my favorite things for sure. Now on the back, we have the standard glass back, which still looks good, curved glass on the front and the back, so it makes this phone feel much thinner than it really is, and this is still a very good feeling phone. As I mentioned before, when you have a device like this, it's still pretty much set for the future, and that's one of my favorite things about this phone. Unfortunately, the software is the one thing that kind of throws me off, but the hardware of this phone, it still looks good. You still have IP certification, you still have wireless charging and all that stuff, so it's still a pretty decent phone for so many people out there. Now in terms of the camera, this thing has that single 12 megapixel wide angle lens on the back, and on the front you kind of have a dual camera setup. There's an 8 megapixel wide angle lens, then you do have a 2 megapixel iris scanner, which is not used for videos I don't think, but here's the thing, you can do 1440p videos on the front and you can do 4K at 60 videos on the back. Now in 2018, some other phones that came out this year were the iPhone XS, XR, and XS Max, and those phones could do 4K at 60 on the back just like this one, but it could do 1080p at 60 on the front, so a little bit of an advantage on those phones. But the S9 wasn't too far behind, and having a higher resolution you can film it on the front is also really good. Now the one thing about the Galaxy S9's camera is that the quality is still pretty good. This is not a bad quality lens, and I think that's a really cool thing. When you're getting a phone like this, you know it's not going to be a horrible performing camera. The only issue I have with this specific lens is the lack of lenses. You don't have an ultra-wide sensor and you don't have a telephoto lens either, and that is kind of a disadvantage. When you get a phone, you may want it to be a little bit stronger in some areas, and in this specific situation, that is pretty much what I was getting. You're not getting the best camera of all time, and when you have something like, the Samsung Galaxy S10 that came out the year after this, that is definitely giving you a much better experience than this device. I don't think this is a bad performing phone or anything like that, but that is a massive thing to keep in mind. I still think, the camera can still shoot photos and videos that look pretty good. You still have a lot of features built into this specific lens as well, which is really, nice, but do keep in mind that when it comes down to it, you're not really getting the craziest quality lens compared to something like the Samsung Galaxy S10. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up in the camera standpoint. Now in terms of the longevity of things, this is the thing that I've kind of hit on before. The problem with the Samsung Galaxy S9 is that when it comes down to the software, it's pretty much outdated. It stopped at One UI 2, and that's the problem with this phone. I would have loved to seen this thing go a little bit longer in terms of software support because the Galaxy S10 did get the next version of software, but the bigger thing to keep in mind with this phone is that it's really not going to be getting any more software updates. It's getting software, it's getting security security updates every once in a while, but it's not going to be getting those big next versions of software that we really would love to see. I think this phone could have easily handled pretty much all the other versions of software that came out with it, to be honest. This phone has a lot of power within it, but I just wouldn't want to recommend a phone that just really isn't going to be getting those software updates, and that is kind of somewhat the problem here. I think everything else about this phone is still pretty solid, but the lack of software updates really puts this phone in a weird position. So in terms of software and the longevity of this phone, that pretty much covers it up there. Now in terms of the performance side of things, this device has that Qualcomm Snapdragon 845 chipset inside of it, the Adreno 630 GPU, and there were a couple of different models of this phone, but all of the models had 4GB of RAM. So when it comes down to the performance side of things with this phone, do keep in mind that this device, the power behind it is actually not that bad. It's still a pretty powerful phone. It doesn't feel like a bad performing phone. And the good thing about the software, one of the good things that came with One UI 2 is the full-on gesture-based design, and that was kind of a big advantage with this specific phone. It doesn't really feel super slow because you do have the gesture-based design behind this thing, so you can use all the gestures and everything with this phone, and that is a pretty big advantage with this device. The only thing I would even kind of somewhat mention with this phone though, is that with the Galaxy S9, it is a pretty glitchy experience, even with those gestures. So when you're maneuvering through the whole entire UI and kind of going through there, things are a little bit weird and things are a little glitchy. But I think everything else beyond that is totally okay. Once you have the apps loaded and everything, it's a totally fine experience and I'm totally okay with it. My only issue is loading up those applications and kind of maneuvering through around with that UI. Apps do kind of open a little, kind of glitchier than expected and, different things like that. But ultimately, once you get an app loaded, I think it's totally okay. Heavier intensive gaming is a little bit of a process on this thing too. And even going along those things, it's going to be a little bit of a different experience for a lot of you. But what I will tell you is that in 2022, the Galaxy S9, it could be it could be worse. I think that's the best way to put it. If I had to use this phone every day, I think I'd be totally fine with it, to be honest. But I do like the Galaxy S9. The performance is good enough for the most part. But I do think with something like, the software limitations, it is starting to show its age, especially with how fast the newer phones are starting to become. It's kind of showing its age on this phone. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now hitting on the battery life of this thing, this device had that 3000 mAh battery inside of it. And, it wasn't a bad battery life for sure. This thing still had a lot of capability at that time, but the S9 Plus had a much bigger size battery, and that may have been a better, way to go for some people out there. But I do think with the Samsung Galaxy S9, it's not like a horrible battery life nowadays, but again, when compared to the latest generation of devices, you are getting a much better battery life on the newer phones. So because of that, that gives the impression that this phone really isn't that great of a battery life, powered device anymore. It still has a lot of capability and everything, but it is another one of those things to keep in mind. So in terms of that covers it up the battery life segment. And to be honest, I think the Samsung Galaxy S9 is still a pretty okay phone in some areas. I just probably wouldn't recommend buying this phone anymore. And the main reason for that is because of the software limitations. It's not getting any more software updates. It's pretty much outdated with software now. And that's the biggest disadvantage with this device. I would have loved to seen this thing get maybe an extra year or two of software updates, but as of right now, it's not going to get it. However, had this thing ended off with One UI 3, that would have been a little bit of a different story. We would have seen this phone probably still being used in a lot of different places and maybe still even being, recommended everywhere. With the Galaxy S10, I recommend that device all the time because it's still supported with software. Unfortunately, with this phone, it's not really supported and there really isn't any point of picking it up nowadays. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.